After Charles Darwin got back from his investigation on the beagle, he actually started to analyze all of his data, and he decided, you know what, there has to be some pattern here. And so he actually started looking at other people's work to see if he could find some pattern or any other explanation for why he was seeing all these different trends in evolution. He didn't know it was evolution by that time, by the way, either. He just knew that there was some reason why these species, which were the same species, had all these different traits to them, and he was trying to explain that. And so let's look at some of the people that he actually got information from that helped him out. Okay, so two of them were geologists. And so Hunt and Lyell are two people that he actually thought, hey, these guys are onto something. At the time, Darwin's time, fundamentalists really believed that the Earth was only about 6 million years old. Hunt and Lyell said no. The Earth is millions of years old. And actually, Charles Lyell, who published a book called The Principles of Geology, became a really big reference point for Darwin. Because you have to remember, when Darwin was on his voyage on the Beagle in South America, he did find fossils at a very high elevation that were from the ocean, that he could not explain why they were there. He also found that beaches were built up where they should have been much lower by the actual surf. They were much higher up, and he had his first earthquake experience. And so he really needed some explanation of why. And Lyell really, his book gave him that basis. Also, Lyell said that islands and other things form because of volcanic activity. Well, that made a little bit of sense because we knew that the Galapagos Islands weren't as old as the mainland. And so there had to be some reason. Well, they were formed by volcanoes. And so we kind of have found out that Lyell was a huge influence on Darwin and why he had some of his processes. Another one was Lamarck. Now, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a French naturalist. He was the first scientist to propose a species change over time. However, Lamarck was totally wrong. His idea was inheritance of adequate characteristics, which was what it was called, was completely incorrect. Traits an organism developed during their own lifetime cannot be passed on to offspring, as Lamarck believed, which means he thought that if you had one change, you could just pass it on to the next generation. And so we know that changes happen over time, and it's a very, very slow process. And so if you look at Lamarck's giraffe-driven idea, it would be like 4 generations, then you have this long-necked giraffe from a short-necked giraffe. Well, that's not what happens. We know that a change in a species will not be seen even in our lifetime. It takes many, many generations and a lot of time. You can't just see a species change that quickly. Now, we can accelerate the process a little bit by doing GMOs or genetic modifications. This is not natural and is not a basis for evolution, but we were able to see this change occur mainly because we're genetically modifying or making a new organism. Mathis is another person that he was really influenced by. Thomas Mathis is a English economics person. And basically he wrote an essay called On Population. And this essay argued that the human population was growing faster than resources would allow, and the population would become too large, and we would have a famine or an outbreak, and the end of the population would basically show us a huge number of people just dying off because we would have insufficient food, space, everything that we needed. Okay, so Mathis, you have to remember this, keep this in perspective, lived from 1766 to 1834. And he projected that we were overpopulating the world then. What do you think he would think of now? Because we have an exponential growth of the human population. And so basically we're seeing this. Darwin isn't applying this to people per se. He actually applied Mathis's idea to species, competition for food. Why do you see one species become extinct over another? So that's where he came from. But also looking at Mathis really quick here, he did a global projection based on what we saw then, and we have seen that this has been modified a little bit to fit modern day, but we're also seeing like this 2020, 8 billion people, 9 billion people by 2030. We can see that our population is exponentially growing. And so one of the things is that we have this exponential growth. Well, humans have a huge influence on other species. And so Darwin found out that nature isn't the only thing that influences them. We are too. He was very aware that humans could breed plants and animals for useful traits. By selecting which animal we would allow to reproduce, we could change the organism's traits. Darwin talks a lot in his book about pigeons, and because pigeons were big in Europe at the time of Darwin, and how they had selected certain traits in pigeons to be good carrier pigeons. This example really doesn't apply to modern day, but farming does. And so farmers have now picked traits in cattle so that we have the best breed of livestock suitable for specific regions. And I picked Longhorns. Longhorns used to be the cattle of choice. Well, Longhorns are great for places like Texas, New Mexico. Longhorns themselves, though, don't fare very well in South Dakota harsh winters. And so we actually have bred them with other species so that they were a little bit hardier, so that they could live in colder environments. And so we can see that we pick these traits because we want species that are larger, we want species that are going to produce more meat, and that are going to survive the weather conditions. And so we've actually artificially bred cattle to fit this. Another species that we breed quite a bit is canines, dogs. You can see that we have many varieties of dogs that would not actually exist if it wasn't for human artificial selection. And one of those species is like the cockadoodle, where you have two species of dogs bred together, so that you have a labradoodle, would be another example, where you have these dogs that don't shed because they have the traits from the poodle, but yet have like the labradoodle, the hunting traits of the lab dog or the Labrador retriever. Now, we have these because we wanted a specific outcome. There is no reason in nature that these would actually be species that would interbreed on a normal basis, but we've chosen that artificial selection to occur. It's not always a good thing, though. We've actually bred dogs to the point where they are going to start to have weaknesses in there, such as we've bred a Dalmatian, which we associate with the fire department all the time, to the point where they're actually almost deaf. Hip dysplasia in larger dogs is a big deal. So we've bred some of these traits, but it's not always for a good reason for it. And then the last guy we have is Wallace. Okay, so Wallace lived at the same time as Charles Darwin. Alfred Wallace actually developed the same theory as Darwin at around the same time as Darwin. He actually corresponded with Darwin, and it was a huge reassurance for Charles Darwin based on, hey, I have the same paper. Why don't you read my paper and see what our ideas are? And so Darwin did, and realized, hey, this guy found the same stuff at the same time, working in a different area, and it confirmed basically, hey, I'm not crazy. This guy found it too. This is great. So why isn't Wallace credited for all this stuff with the theory of evolution? Well, Wallace withdrew his paper based on the church saying, hey, we don't agree with this is wrong. And Wallace withdrew his paper. And so he was actually never published for his evidence of evolution. He he had a big family. He took care of his kids, his wife, and lived happily there. And so we don't really have a lot of stuff on Wallace in the history book because he decided, hey, I'm not going to fight it. I don't want to be this big guy. We're going to just go on with our normal lives and every day. But he was a huge confirmation for Darwin because he had the same paper, the same beliefs, the same theory at the same time. And so they did correspond quite a bit before Darwin published his book, Origin of Species. And Darwin did publish his book, Origin of Species, before Wallace was able to, and so he is accredited as the father. Charles Darwin is accredited as the father of evolution.